Welcome to the Delmarva Almanac. Each week we connect you to the best of Delmarva. If you're interested in environmentally friendly building practices, you'll want to hear our next story, when Naturalist Dave Wilson shares his conversation with LEED certified architect David Quillin. Here are the two Davids.
My guest today is David Quillin, the principal of David Quillin Architecture of Berlin, Maryland. The firm designs both residential and commercial green building, as well as standard buildings. For my work here on the shore, I can tell you that David does an enormous amount of work for nonprofits, including the Maryland Coastal Bays Program, Habitat for Humanity, and Diakonia, to name a few. The firm actually had the first Energy Star certified Habitat for Humanity home on Delmarva and did the first LEED certified animal shelter east of the Mississippi. I know firsthand that he is actually a really good drummer and surfer too. Dave obtained his Master's of Architecture degree from the Catholic University of America in 1993 and did most of his interning work in San Francisco. David lives outside of Berlin with his wife and two daughters, who are actually the fourth generation of his family to grow up on the property. Today we're going to discuss green building, what it is, and how folks might go about doing it. Dave, good morning.
Morning, Dave. Thanks for having me.
First, tell our listeners a little bit about green building. What is it, and is there a standard by which it's defined?
Well, green building, which is also known as sustainable design, is really just that. It's trying to build in a way that is sustainable, so that our buildings don't end up degrading the planet. The way we're building currently is not sustainable. Our buildings are contributing quite a lot to climate change and resource depletion. So it's very important. A lot of people don't realize this, but almost half of all the energy that we consume as a society are consumed by our buildings, both in creating the buildings, constructing them, operating them, and even in demolition. So, there's a lot of talk about miles per gallon for cars, but the single biggest sector we need to address if we want to address our energy usage is the building sector. Now, green building actually looks at a number of different issues, like where should development go, toxicity of materials. But one of the major focuses of green building is to reduce energy consumption. And green architects who are focused on green design look at energy consumption in a building in three different stages of the building. It's both at its birth, at its life, and even at the end of its useful life. So during the birth of a building, during the construction period, that can use 30 to 50% of all the energy that building is going to consume over its lifetime. And it's not so much assembling the materials where the energy is, it's in what's called embodied energy of the materials themselves. So the energy that it took to extract the material, to process it, to refine it, even before it shows up on the job site, that's all known as embodied energy. So it's really important for green architects to try to specify materials that have low embodied energy. Those materials are things like wood, gypsum, cement, bricks. Recycled materials almost always have much lower embodied energy, and also local materials have lower embodied energy. You can imagine if you specify stone that comes in from Oregon, by the time it gets to the job site, there's quite a lot of energy consumption that's already gone into that. So generally, it's the materials that have undergone less processing. Materials that have a very high embodied energy that it's better to try to avoid are things like plastics, vinyls, metals, fiberglass, materials that take quite a bit of processing even before they show up on a job site. So that's during the birth of the building, what the architect can look at. Now, during day-to-day operation of the building, I think people are generally more familiar with that and what an energy efficient building means. I like to think of it, you can look at three different areas of how to reduce the energy consumption of a building and its operation. The first one is to use site design to moderate the loads that are going to get to the building itself. Frank Lloyd Wright had a quote that most people find a piece of land and they find the most sacred spot on that piece of land, and then they ruin it by putting the building there. So don't put your building right on top of the hill. Don't put your building right at the edge of the water. Use the site to really buffer the loads that are going to get to it. So obvious, easy ways to do that are plant evergreen trees to the northwest of your building. If you're here in the Mid-Atlantic area, we have prevailing cold winter winds that come out of the northwest. Put deciduous trees to the south and to the west of your building, and they'll shade the building in the summer and keep some of that heating load to get or cooling load getting to the building. Now, some climate loads, though, are going to get to the shell of your building. So the second step to look at is make as tight and super insulated a shell as you possibly can to keep those loads from transmitting through the building envelope into the occupants. So you want an envelope that's as airtight as possible, and a typical house has up to 5 air changes an hour, meaning all of the air in that house is leaking out through 1,000 little gaps 5 times an hour. So that's the air you're paying to heat and to cool. So if you can make that airtight, which anything below 1 air change per hour is considered quite tight, that's a huge energy savings right there. And also, like I mentioned, make the building as thermally resistant as possible, meaning super insulate. Adding insulation usually has a very low payback period. And then finally, some loads are going to get into the interior of the building. And so the last step you want to take is use the highest efficiency equipment possible in order to deal with those loads. So for a typical house right now, still a geothermal heat pump is about the most efficient system, although there's another system called ductless mini splits coming out that are getting very good and are comparable. And then finally, the third area, the death of the building. So you want to design so that you can prolong the death of the building as much as possible. You want to make the building durable. So it can be the most energy efficient building possible. If it only lasts 20 years, that's a huge loss of energy consumption. So it's got to be durable. Part of that is it has to be adaptable. If buildings are designed for a very specific function, and then over time that function changes, the building's no longer useful, it won't be maintained, it'll get torn down. And then finally, one that's really big to me is it's got to be lovable. Buildings take maintenance, and people only do maintenance if they love the building and they're willing to invest that time. So I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the homes in the 70s that were super green, but they were ugly as a dog. Nobody wanted to keep them up. They ended up being there for 15 or 20 years and torn down, so they didn't end up being green at all.
Are there any good web resources that are available to go to find out more about green building?
Well, you can go to my website, which has some information on it. Then also the U.S. Department of Energy has a home section that has quite a lot of very good information on it. The EPA also has a very good section on building green. And then finally, one resource that I use a lot is called the Green Building Advisor. It's a website, and it's got extremely good information. It does require a fee to access a lot of the information, though. So you might want to take a look and see what you can get on there for free first.
Thanks, Dave. We've been talking to David Quillin, the principal of David Quillin Architecture of Berlin. To find out more about David Quillin's work and green building, go to delmarvaalmanac.com/nature.
Well, that's all for this edition of the Delmarva Almanac. Be sure to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, and next week join us to learn more about our local culture and get connected to our natural wonders. We'd like to thank our community partners, the Friends of Delmarva Public Radio, and our underwriters for their help in bringing this program to you, our audience. If you'd like to become an underwriter for this program, visit delmarvaalmanac.com/support. Our theme music was provided by Brightside Studio. This show has been a Moonshell production. Thanks for listening. Until we meet again, may the rhythms and tides of Delmarva bring you good fortune.